Jesus, we thank you for the gift of rain. We do pray that as you cleanse the air and refresh the soil, that you would cleanse our hearts and refresh our spirits. And in our time gathered today, we ask that you would be our teacher, that we would learn today those things that you know we need, and that we would come to better appreciate the gift of the Anglican communion in our own lives. And we pray all of this in your name, Lord. Amen. So today is probably not that exciting for most people. We're going to be talking about polity, or church structure. But if I'm going to be talking about Anglican fundamentals, I think it's an important one to talk about, because we live in a particular church structure for a reason, and it's important to know what those reasons are, but I think it's also simply important to understand so that we understand why we do the things that we do. And part of the reason I say that is that in recent years, what I've come to see is that the Anglican Church seems to have a gift for healing people who are coming out of more fundamentalist backgrounds. And as they do, what happens sometimes, I've noticed, is that they come with a certain idea of what all church structures must be, and then they're confused by why we do what we do. So we'll touch on that as we move forward. So again, probably not the most exciting topic, but as a fundamental, it really is important for how we live our life as a congregation. So the place we start is the Anglican Communion. For those of you who've been here from the beginning of this course, you'll remember that in the first 2 weeks, we did an overview of the history of the church from about AD 30 all the way up to present day. So we did that in about an hour. We didn't go very deep. But one of the things that we talked about in that church history is that the church in England during the Reformation under Henry VIII became the Church of England. And then as history continued to unfold, England became the British Empire. And when England became the British Empire, it was said that the sun never sets on the empire. They went around the world, and it was a huge empire. And as the empire went forward, so the Anglican Church went with it. And then as history continued to unfold, those colonies of the British Empire began to earn their independence. And as they did, the question then became, what does the Church of England do in a colony that is no longer underneath the British Empire? Because the Church of England made you take an oath of loyalty to the sovereign of England. So where did it all start? The American Revolution. In the American Revolution, people were conflicted. You had loyalists and you had those who were patriots, people who were going to be loyal to the Crown of England because as a clergy person they took an oath to do so, others who said it's time for a change. Then after the revolution was won and America had her independence, the question then became, how do you make clergy people in this new United States of America under an Anglican church that requires loyalty to the sovereign of England? And as you remember in that very brief history, the initial solution was to go to Scotland. And they went to Scotland and they got some people ordained up in Scotland and were able to come back and not be loyal to England. And then England very quickly picked up on that, and Parliament made some changes so that you could be an Anglican without having to swear allegiance to the sovereign of England. So that's the beginning then of the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion is the third largest Christian body in the world. Roman Catholicism is first, Eastern Orthodoxy second, and the Anglican Communion with 70 some odd million members is third. So we're not that huge here in the United States, but if you go to places like Nigeria, a single diocese in Nigeria is larger than all the Anglicans and Episcopalians in America put together. They have dioceses with about 1 million members underneath a bishop. So the Anglican Communion worldwide is robust and big. And it's said that the average Anglican in the world is an African woman in her 30s. So when you think about the Anglican Communion worldwide, one thing that you really need to do is stop thinking of old white men. The average Anglican, if we're just going to play sheer numbers, is going to be an African woman, a young one. That may have changed, but the most recent data I have say that, and there's no reason to really think that it's changed significantly. So the Anglican Communion has 42 provinces. So what happened is, again, the British Empire spread, and these colonies, as they gained independence, then became what is called a province. So in the United States of America, for example, when we won independence from England, the Church of England in the colonies then was changed to the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, PECUSA. And it was eventually then renamed formally as the Episcopal Church, TEC. So that became a province. And for the most part, provinces are going to be national churches, kind of national geographical areas, and they're autonomous. So every province has its own governance. But on the worldwide level, the Anglican Communion is 42 provinces, and this is on your sheet of paper there, in 165 countries, and there are 5 extra-provincial churches. Things like the military jurisdiction in Europe is going to be an extra-provincial church. So it's not geographically based, but it is, so it's not a province, but it's extra-provincial. So across the world are these 42 autonomous provinces. But they all come together every 10 years at Lambeth Palace in London for what's called the Lambeth Conference. And the bishop who has primacy over all, or is the first among peers, is the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's the historic understanding. Question?
I read somewhere, I saw an article maybe a few weeks ago, I don't remember exactly when, but that we're separating from Canterbury.
Yes, that may have been the article I wrote in the Messenger or something else. Okay. So there's a lot going on right now. Okay. So put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. So what I simply want people to understand at this point is that every province is autonomous, but they're held together by, Anglicans have nice terms for everything, by the bonds of affection. So we choose to walk together. All of that in the last 30 years or so has become incredibly strained, the bonds of affection. Okay. So our province is a brand new province called the Anglican Church in North America. So in the early 2000s, there was a partnered homosexual elected bishop in New Hampshire. The rest of the Anglican Communion, all the other provinces said, please do not consecrate him. That is going to break the bonds of affection. But the Episcopal Church did it anyway. And as a result of that, the bonds of affection were broken, and there were several provinces that then came together that are the more traditional side of the church. And they came together in 2008 in a group called GAFCON, Global Anglican Futures Conference. And they came together and they produced something called the Jerusalem Declaration that said we're not held together by the Archbishop of Canterbury, we're held together by Jerusalem, the faith once delivered. So they wanted to go all the way back to Jesus and say this is what matters. And so at that time, in 2008, when they were gathered together, they called for the formation of authentic Anglicanism in North America. So in 2009, the Anglican Church in North America was formed, and it was formed out of some dioceses that had left the Episcopal Church. This diocese here of San Joaquin was the first to do so. So we became part of the founding members of the Anglican Church in North America, which has got a broad name because as a province, we've got places in Canada, we've got places in Mexico, we've got places in the United States. And we've brought together a lot of disaffected Anglicans down through the years. So the Reformed Episcopal Church that broke off from the Episcopal Church in the 1880s was part of the ACNA. So it brought together all of these different Anglican groups that had splintered for a lot of different reasons. I'm not going to talk about the mess that continues to be. I think the way our first Archbishop Duncan, put it was, The historical necessity is that we are going to build the plane in flight. They didn't wait until they got everything ironed out so that they thought nothing would go wrong. They just said, let's start flying. And we've been cleaning up the mess ever since. And we have some messes as a province that came from that hasty formation. Okay. Question?
Who does the African provinces lean towards, or do they lean towards?
Most of the African provinces are going to be part of GAFCON, or what's called the Global South Fellowship, the traditional side of the church. The vast majority of the 2/3 world is traditional, but all the money is in the Western church, and they tend to be far more progressive. And that's been part of what held the church together, in my humble opinion. I may regret saying this and having it on YouTube, but part of what held the church, in my humble opinion, together was just money. Why do people stay in bad marriages? Because it costs too much to get out of it. And what happened in the Anglican world is that the Western world became progressive, but they had a lot of money, and they financially supported the traditional part of the world who didn't have any money. And that kind of relationship, that colonial relationship, I think held things together for far too long. And what started to happen in the early 2000s is there were African provinces that said, we would rather have nothing than continue to walk with you. And so they became part of GAFCON. So what's happened in just the last month or so is that in the Anglican communion, there are different instruments of communion that hold the Anglican communion together. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Anglican Consultative Council, and Lambeth Conference. Those are the three instruments of communion. So unlike Roman Catholicism, we do not have a magisterium. In the Roman Catholic world, the way you hold everything together is you sit the Pope down on a chair, and whatever he says is now the truth. That's a magisterium. Everyone reports to the Pope, period. Anglicanism does not have a magisterium. We have 42 autonomous provinces. And so there's no one person or one body that gets to say what goes for everyone else, which is why the Episcopal Church could do something that the rest of the communion was saying, please don't do that. They just said, we're going to do what we want to do, and we believe the Holy Spirit is leading us into this new truth. So what's happened is that the Global Anglican Futures Conference and the Global South Fellowship have now said bluntly, the instruments of communion have failed, and we are now calling for the formation of a global Anglican communion. So a new Anglican presence that's built on what's called the Jerusalem Declaration that came from 2008, that holds up the 39 Articles and the Faith Once Delivered and the 1662 Prayer Book as normative for Anglicanism. So no longer can progressive Christianity claim to be normative for Anglicanism, as it has in the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, the Church of England, that is. What this group is saying is that it needs to adhere to the 39 Articles, which is going to be a Reformation document that is very traditional in its understanding.
Well, that's
So-
been a long time coming.
It's been a slow wreck, but it's not a surprise to anyone involved in it.
It just
So-
seems so odd that the Archbishop of Canterbury has been lingering
Yes.
as a mist above provinces.
Yeah, so we have a long, interesting history with our respect for the Archbishop of Canterbury as being the first among equals. And that's really been what's held the communion together, is choosing archbishops who could somehow say something and nothing at the same time. That's my very not kind way of saying it. It was a very political office, and they were able to hold things together until now. And this most recent election made it very clear that the instruments of communion had failed.
So, given this new development or series of developments, how long will that take to
Yeah.
solidify?
So for the sake of the video online, the question is, how long is it going to take to know what the global Anglican communion is going to look like? I think the answer is we'll see.
The
My-
answer is what?
We'll see. We don't know, and it's bringing all these provinces together and getting them to agree with each other is going to be a work of the Holy Spirit, and it's probably not going to be quick. And that's classic Anglican understanding as well. Anglicans understand that tradition can change very slowly and uniformly. So I think something's going to be happening fairly quickly in terms of church history time, but as Americans, it's going to feel very slow. Americans want something done yesterday. This is not going to move that quickly, but in historical terms, it'll be pretty quick. Yeah. So I hadn't really intended to go into all that other than to say the Anglican Church in North America is a new province founded in 2009, and that's what we are a part of. Our structure is similar to the Episcopal Church, but has some notable differences. And one of the most notable differences is that we do not have a presiding bishop, we have an archbishop. Technical terms, you're probably not going to care because it really doesn't impact you that much, but an archbishop is different than a presiding bishop. A presiding bishop does not have a diocese. So they're not in charge of anything anymore other than being in charge of the corporation of the entire province. An archbishop is a seated bishop, and they're still in charge of a diocese. So to put it in a different way, they've still got a job. They've got a day job. They're no longer unconcerned with what's going on at the grassroots level. They're still in charge of a grassroots level. And as an archbishop, though, they have a little bit more authority to speak in the church. So an archbishop is elected, they serve a term, but in the Anglican Church in North America, they are elected by the bishops in conclave. So we've gone a little Roman Catholic in that. They gather all the bishops together and they think and they pray, and every single bishop in the College of Bishops who is a seated diocesan is eligible to become the archbishop. And they think and they pray and they cast votes, and then after so many votes, it becomes clear who it's going to be. Okay. So we've just recently elected Archbishop Steve Wood last summer. There's a lot of scandal right now. We don't know where all that's going to lead. He is on administrative leave while they investigate the charges. So we'll just kind of leave that there. It sounds kind of ominous, and it really is not a good thing. The good news in it is that the church is taking the charges seriously and they're addressing it properly. But within the ACNA, you've got the archbishop, and then underneath the archbishop, or what we would call a primate, not a primate, that's a monkey, primate. So every province has a primate. They're going to have a presiding bishop or an archbishop or somebody called a primate. So our primate is an archbishop. Underneath that are all of the different dioceses. So if you look at your diagram under the ACNA, and I didn't have room to put it all in here, there are a whole bunch of dioceses in the ACNA, and every diocese has a bishop. And the bishop is the spiritual head of the diocese. And again, it's not on your diagram because we don't have enough room for it, but underneath a diocese, you've got a bishop and convention. The bishop is the ecclesiastical authority, so all things pertaining to the faith, that's the bishop. So he's the prime teacher and celebrant in the diocese, the guardian of the faith. The convention is in charge of the temporal life of the diocese. So bills, money, the corporate life. The convention, though, meets once a year, and it's made up of elected representatives. So we've got delegates from every congregation and clergy. All clergy who are called canonically resident, so I don't expect you to remember any of this, but clergy have to have residence somewhere under a bishop. You cannot be a clergy person in the Anglican world without being under the authority of a bishop. There are some clergy who've been in this area who are not canonically resident in this area. There are some clergy who are out of this area who are canonically resident here. So Father Steve Wieselski in Eastern Europe is canonically resident at Trinity Anglican Church in Bakersfield and is under the authority of Bishop Manise. Father Frank Bernardi in North Africa is canonically resident at St. Paul's in Visalia and is underneath the authority of Bishop Eric Manise. Okay? So clergy are always under the authority of a bishop. And when it comes to convention, if you're clergy, you're automatically supposed to be there. And you have seat, voice, and vote. Delegates are elected from every congregation, and the representation is based on the population of the church. So what you're going to start hearing is, gosh darn, this sounds like the setup of the United States of America. And you know what? They built the Episcopal Church at the same time that they built the United States government. And some of the people who are building the United States government were Anglicans. Okay? So you're going to hear a lot of similarity. So in convention, it's a bicameral house. Clergy who are there simply because they're clergy. You cannot keep the clergy from convention. You cannot take away their seat, voice, and vote, period. Delegates are voted in every year at the annual meeting of every congregation. So every congregation has to have a meeting every year where they elect delegates, and you get the number of delegates based on your average Sunday attendance. So the bigger you are, the bigger voice you get. So it's like the House of Representatives. So here, the bigger your church is, the more say you have at convention. But no matter how small you are, you still get delegates at convention. So at convention, they do the business of the diocese once a year. We always meet the last weekend in October. And one of the main things that they do there is they pass the budget. They can also pass resolutions that express the mind of convention. They can change the articles of incorporation or the constitution of the diocese and the canons of the diocese. They can force certain things to happen in the diocese. They're in charge. So the bishop is the ecclesiastical authority, but the people, the lay people and clergy, are really the ones in charge of the diocese. But they're not always there to do business. So underneath convention is the standing committee. And the role of the standing committee is they are there to enact the will of convention. So convention passes a budget, the standing committee holds the diocese to the budget. So convention doesn't have to meet every time something has to happen. So they express the will of convention, standing committee gets it done. Standing committee is made up of elected representatives lay and clergy from each deanery. Aren't you so glad you're here today? So the diocese, we changed our canons several years ago to divide. We used to have, I think, 5 deaneries. We're now 4 deaneries: south, central, north, and east-west. And the deanery then elects a lay person to represent that deanery in standing committee and a clergy person. So right now, our clergy representative, we are the southern deanery. Each deanery has a dean. I am the dean of the southern deanery. So if you ever see in my title, the Very Reverend, Very is a dean. I'm a dean. The rural deans are the people who are kind of the conduit between the bishop and the deaneries. So I have to meet with the bishop once a month in a meeting where we are a body of counsel to the bishop, but we also funnel information back and forth between the deanery and the bishop. So I have to know what my clergy are doing so that I can tell the bishop what's going on in the deanery. If the deanery has a big issue, like one time they said, we really want to revisit a policy that standing committee put in place, so that became my job. I needed to take that to the bishop and rural deans and to the standing committee. Our clergy representative right now is Father Stubblefield, and our lay representative who was just elected is Mr. Ed Taylor. So our deanery covers churches in Bakersfield, Tehachapi, Ridgecrest, and Porterville. And our clergy meet once a month in something called clericus. We do it by Zoom because we're so geographically spread. But we meet in order to just keep up with one another and again funnel information back and forth from the office of the bishop to the deaneries. So this is the diocesan level. And our understanding is that the bishop represents the church. This is a fundamental level of structure in the ACNA. So dioceses they're not autonomous in that there is a college of bishops that holds bishops accountable, but they do have a level of autonomy in the way that they do business. So a bishop from another diocese cannot come into this diocese and do anything. A bishop from another diocese can't come in here and tell me how to do my job, but Bishop Eric can. Okay, so a diocese is a discrete unit, and they take care of their own business. The fundamental level of ministry, though, in the ACNA, something that was said in their constitution, is that the primary agent of ministry is the local congregation. And that's a shift from the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church used to say that the diocese was the primary agent of mission. And so really a local congregation was somehow part of the diocese doing business, and there was a lot more sense of trying to have a shared vision that everyone needed to buy into. And the ACNA kind of looked at that and said, that's just kind of dumb. It doesn't, it's a great idea, it sounds nice, but it's not functionally going to work. For example, doing church in Bakersfield is completely different than doing church in Porterville. Or when we had churches in really small towns, if you're going to go into Lindsay, you're going to have a different mission than a church in Fresno, because Fresno is an urban area and Lindsay is going to be a rural area. And so to try to make them all have the same mission is just kind of silly. You need to leave it at the lowest level so that they can respond to their own environment more agilely, right? So the Episcopal Church said it was at a diocesan level. They then, in the 1920s, decided to follow the corporate model of America, and they tried to kick it up to a provincial level. And that's when they got a presiding bishop. This is more than anyone really wants to know, and I'm running myself out of time. See, this is more exciting to me than you think. So we'll just leave that. Let's get back down here. So, underneath convention, then, are congregations. We'll just call them congregations. At a congregational level, you've got a rector. I'm the rector. The word means ruler. Thank you. And then you also have a vestry. We have called our vestry a board of directors. That's due to the lawsuit and legal counsel to drop all Episcopal nomenclature, blah, 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 blah. But we call it a board of directors. It's a vestry. So just watch how it mirrors things. I am in charge of all things that are spiritual, and the vestry is in charge of all things temporal. So the vestry controls the purse strings, but they can't tell me how to do worship. They can't pick the hymns. If it has to do with worship, it's me and me alone, buddy. That's my job. Just like at the diocesan level, the convention cannot tell the bishop what to teach. That's his job. So the vestry is made up of elected members who are elected at that yearly meeting. One thing that's different between convention and a vestry is that at the vestry level, they're in charge of all things temporal, not the congregation. It's truly representative. Once you put someone on the vestry, sit down and shut up, right? So the vestry gets to build the budget, the vestry votes on the budget, the vestry controls all of that, and the congregation, their only real input is who they elected to the vestry. Okay? That's our structure. It's built to be a safeguard. The vestry here cannot fire me because I work for the bishop. The vestry can, however, cut my pay down to zero. Okay? And then the vestry has to talk to the bishop and say, we want to dissolve our relationship with our rector. I really pray that's not going to happen, and I don't think it will. But it's a safeguard. It's a safeguard to keep from a vestry having too much power, and it's a safeguard against a rector having too much power. They have to work together. Okay. So that brings it down to the congregational level. So if you look on your chart there, we've got me as the parish rector, and I have a vestry. We work side by side. On the vestry, you have a senior warden and a junior warden. The senior warden is technically in charge of the congregation in the event that I'm incapacitated or unable to act. So functionally, Father Stubblefield is going to step up and do most of the work, but legally, the senior warden, who is Steve McCauley, he'll be in charge of the church. I appoint the senior warden, because if they're going to be in charge of what I'm in charge of, I should have the say on who that is. The vestry then elects a junior warden. So if I'm incapacitated, it goes senior warden. If senior warden is incapacitated, it goes the junior warden. The junior warden is elected by the vestry. So they're all often called the people's warden. Okay. Loosely, the junior warden is in charge of buildings and grounds. That's the tradition. So they're always in charge of the facility. So it's easier to find a senior warden who usually don't have to do very much versus a junior warden who has a lot of responsibility. Underneath the clergy, or underneath the rector, are all the clergy. So Father Spencer reports to me, Deacon Ron and Deacon John report to me, and then I have a staff. Okay? So they all report to me. That's our structure. The staff and the clergy do not work for the vestry, only I do. The rest of them work for me.
So, do the deacons also have a relationship to the bishop?
Yes, the deacons are directly under the bishop's authority, but the bishop places them under the authority of the local clergy. Yeah. So functionally, they report to me, but if the bishop ever says to them, I don't care what Father Carl says, I want you to do this, they do that.
Can the bishop place
Yes.
one of our deacons?
Bishops place deacons. Bishop Eric's practice is to leave them where they're raised up because that's the best for the church. But for example, Deacon Leslie Arbogast, who serves at All Saints, was actually raised up at what is now Ascension. And that was primarily because All Saints needed help, and Ascension at that time had 3 clergy and didn't need a 4th. Yeah. So underneath me, there's also a leadership core. That's the vestry, ministry leaders, and engaged participants. We break ourselves in our own structure down into areas of worship, learning, fellowship, outreach, and communication. And the vestry is in charge of administrative oversight of property, finances, legal issues, and also protecting the vision of the church and being those who enable support of the means and methods and the clergy in order to accomplish that vision. So that's kind of a whirlwind on our end, but I hope that gives you a little bit of feel for how we're structured as a church and how, on a functional level, we are congregational. On a functional level. We really do what we want to do. But on a spiritual level, we are hierarchical. We are underneath authority. So that is Anglican polity basics for you.
One last question?
One last question.
So are the African dioceses exporting clergy to the U.S. or elsewhere?
There are African clergy who are coming to the U.S. We have a Sudanese clergyman out in Ridgecrest. Yeah.
And that probably will.
Probably continue. I don't think it's as spiritually driven as it is sometimes political asylum and economically driven. People just looking for better opportunity. They want to be Americans. Yeah. So next week we're going to start the course on Advent. And we'll kind of look in the first week just what is Advent, and then we'll look at 4 of the great themes of Advent. So we'll see you next week. It will be completely different than this. Thank you for sticking with me through these, 11 weeks. Blessings.